to get my stopwatch started so I don't go over time. So I just wanted to thank you all so much for being here this afternoon, and a special shout out to those who are also here this morning. We're going into 6 hours of mental health workshops, so thank you so much. And not only are we going into 6 hours of workshops, you're also dealing with me twice, so thank you for sticking around. But my name is Baumhardt. I'm a part of this wonderful group of people, and I'm just so excited to be discussing a topic I'm extremely passionate about, something that has affected my life, and I am sure the lives of many people in this room, as well as millions of Americans around the country. So I will be talking today about anxiety, and this morning I had the opportunity to talk about it in relation to teenagers, but this one is entirely focused on you, how anxiety works for you. So it's titled The Dizziness of Freedom, and I will be getting into that. It's actually a very famous quote from a philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard, and I'll be explaining that a little bit more. But first I wanted to talk about just a little bit of who I am, what I do. I am a licensed social worker. I got both of my degrees at the University of Cincinnati, go Cats. I graduated with my master's in 2021, and I started working in a psychiatric hospital doing intake. I left that job in April, and I've since been working in a hospice service as a bereavement counselor. So I work with families post the passing of their loved ones, doing any sort of grief support that I can. I'm also a certified grief recovery specialist, so I recently got that certification. I'll hopefully be leading groups soon, but I work with those who are working through grief situations to help them find what we call completion. So that's what I do professionally, but what I really want to talk about is why anxiety is important to me and my anxiety story. So anxiety plays a role in my life very early on. When I was about 8 or 9, I went through the Midwest rite of passage, which is the first tornado scare. I was in 2nd grade. It was the day before spring break, and we had a tornado almost touch down in town, and it was just a very scary experience because we were trying to leave, and then they were pulling us back in. It was very scary. That set off kind of a chain of events in my brain where for the next long period of time I was very paranoid about storms, very paranoid about tornadoes. I would wake up my parents every time there was like a breeze at night or something and tell them a tornado was coming, get in the basement. Looking back, I now realize that wasn't really normal for an 8 or 9-year-old to be really worried about. Anxiety continued to play a role throughout high school. I was in a very competitive high school situation in our music program, and especially in marching band. I would be so anxious during the season that I would wake up nauseous just every morning, couldn't eat, and I would lose 20 to 40 pounds per season because I literally just could not function during that time. Anxiety continued to persist throughout college. College worked for my brain a little bit more, so it was a little bit better, but it was especially bad during grad school because I was trying to get my degree during a pandemic. What was supposed to be in person was completely online, and nobody was really prepared. What ended up happening was in February of 2021, a medication issue that I had actually ended up causing my anxiety to go so out of control, I ended up in the ER. I had an out-of-body experience. I was very just overwhelmed with anxiety, and I was pretty much helpless for almost the next month. During that period, my parents really had to step in and help me. I mean, I couldn't remember to eat meals. I could barely take care of myself, and they really were instrumental in helping me kind of get back on my feet during that period. But anxiety has brought me to my knees many, many times in my life, and which is why it's kind of the way we treat it has become really important to me. And if there's one thing I've had to realize and learn during this whole experience is that for those of us who have anxiety and have anxiety on a regular basis, to understand our anxiety is to understand ourselves in a lot of ways. And the more we try to fight it and push it and kind of stuff it, the worse it's going to get. It's something that we're meant to build a relationship with rather than try to fight on a daily basis. So in order to understand this, in order to kind of build a relationship with it, I want to look at anxiety in kind of 3 different facets. kind of the mind, body, soul of anxiety. So we'll start actually kind of with the soul aspect. We'll deal with the metaphysical, and then the psychological, which is kind of the more cognitive mind aspect, and then the physiological. So I mentioned earlier that Soren Kierkegaard quoted that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, and so that's where we'll be going with the metaphysical. So there's a lot of different philosophical interpretations of anxiety. When Kierkegaard is discussing how it's the dizziness of freedom, he's talking about how anxiety represents the idea of possibility and choice. So anxiety represents the possible choices we have, and it also compels us to act upon them. I want you to imagine that you are hiking on a cliffside. It's like maybe you're in Pikes Peak or something like that. I just remember like driving up that, and it was so anxiety-inducing because there's just nothing on the other side of you, just a straight cliffside coming down. You look over in the side of the cliff, and you have this thought to yourself, this moment of, I could jump off that. That kind of weird, intrusive thought of like, I could make that choice and jump that. And so that dizziness of that feeling, that kind of anticipation of confusion is what he calls the dizziness of freedom, where we're compelled by the freedom of our choices and the anxiety that comes with that to act upon them. And it can kind of help us come to grips with all the choices we have in front of us. Sartre, who's another famous philosopher, argued that anxiety is, again, a discussion of freedom. It recognizes the radical freedom of the future self with regards to the present self. So it's kind of another discussion of how many choices we have before us, as well as how many different paths our lives can go down. So that freedom of the future self in regards to the present choices that we make can cause a lot of anxiety. He also argues that it's a role in identity. Anxiety recognizes that when we make choices, our whole being is in play, and our choices define our identity. So all of the choices that we choose to make have a role in shaping and growing our identity as people. And so our whole being is in these choices, which is what Sartre considered to be representative of anxiety. Heidegger, who was another famous philosopher, argued that anxiety helps us to comprehend our relationship with the world. So it helps us to comprehend our relationship with the world by looking at it in its totality. So kind of that big picture philosophy of where we understand kind of who we are in kind of the grander system of things, the larger system of things, is that kind of anxiety of when we feel that song that says, I hope you still feel small when you stand beside the ocean. It's kind of that relationship with the world, that anxiety. And then Kierkegaard also theorized that anxiety perpetuates growth by recognizing the need for personal responsibility and the power of learning from experience. So that kind of actually plays into the idea of resilience, and that we learn from experience, and kind of the uncomfortable nature of learning is that anxiety that Kierkegaard theorized came with the growth. So there's a lot of different theories on kind of how anxiety exists and what its role is, just philosophically. And I think it can seem like it's almost being argued as something empowering rather than paralyzing. But what if it's not? What if instead of feeling compelled or empowered, we actually feel paralyzed, which I think is actually something that can happen a lot more often. And so what I want to talk about with this feeling of paralyzation is something called the anxious cycle. So the anxious cycle is a cycle that kind of discusses like how our anxiety impacts our lives in a cyclical way. There's actually a similar cycle for depressive symptoms as well, and they're actually kind of pretty similar to each other in the way they kind of play out. But with the anxious cycle, the idea is that in stage 1, we experience any distressing or anxiety-inducing event. And so our natural response when it comes to wanting to survive or wanting to avoid fearful or unhealthy situations is we want to run and get relief from that. So that's typically what we do, is we retreat in some way, either getting out of that situation or self-medicating, or in some capacity we try to kind of back off from that stimulus. When we do that, we create short-term relief. So we get this feeling of relief, which conditions us to continue that behavior. We want to keep doing that because we like the feeling that we get when we avoid that stimuli. However, it's kind of a double-edged sword because we become more sensitive to negative experiences afterwards, because the more we retreat and the less we expose ourselves to these kind of uncomfortable stimuli, the more sensitive we end up becoming to that stimuli the next time it happens, or even when something less distressing happens to us. So then, because we become more susceptible and more vulnerable to that stimuli, we continue to retreat because we are uncomfortable, more and more uncomfortable, trying to get out of that stimuli. So what ends up happening overall is that the anxiety symptoms increase because we become more preoccupied with avoiding negative stimuli. We worry more, we have less growth through our experiences, and we experience impaired resilience. So we don't really get to form, I guess, what I would call like emotional calluses in a sense, where we don't have experience with these stimuli and they just become more painful. And so instead of growing in the way that we kind of looked at these philosophies earlier, we become kind of more paralyzed. So it's kind of like the idea of Newton's first law of motion, where a body in motion stays in motion, where a body at rest tends to stay at rest. And when the more longer we stay at rest when it comes to avoiding negative stimuli and our anxiety, the harder it is to get back into motion, the harder it is to kind of be able to reintegrate with those painful stimuli. So when it comes to anxiety, the way we really beat it is by kind of breaking that anxious cycle in very small ways. I'm not asking you to go bungee jumping or bull riding or anything like that. I would literally die if I went bungee jumping. Like, actually, I would go into cardiac arrest. But there are small ways to kind of break that anxious cycle. So some of these ways are first by challenging our thoughts, and these are identifying core beliefs and challenging unhelpful thinking styles. So what's actually exciting about this is Erica will actually be discussing these core beliefs later. So when she's discussing that, I want you to think about how some of the core beliefs she just talks about, and I think that are also listed in your packet, may be contributing to either your anxiety symptoms or ways that you try to avoid negative stimuli. And then unhelpful thinking styles are ways of thinking that we've developed over time to help cope with our day-to-day life that actually don't serve us in the end. So these are ways that we may catastrophize things, or we predict what we think other people think about us, or just things like that, where they help us survive in a sense, but they're not healthy and they don't help us cope. So feelings are learning to sit with negative feelings and learning to differentiate sensations from reality. When I worked in inpatient psych, I dealt with a lot of aggression and a lot of violence from my clients, and I would get this really intense burning feeling in my stomach when it would happen, and this very like freezing, it felt like antifreeze was like poured into my whole body. And so what I would do is, because I knew like if I want to keep this job for as long as I can't avoid this, I would go back in my office and sit, and I would think about the exact sensations that were happening in my stomach, and I would try to differentiate like what's actually going on and what's my body just doing right now. And it actually ended up really helping in the long run because it helped me kind of compartmentalize the situation instead of being overwhelmed by the whole thing. And then our behaviors is identifying behavior patterns that continue to increase anxiety and learn how to change them. So in breaking that anxious cycle, some of the ways we can do that in small ways are we can be more anxious in the morning because we're in a rush, we're trying to get ready for work, we might be running late to work, things like that. One of the ways to break the anxious cycle can be preventative by maybe laying out your clothes the night before, or packing your lunch and putting it in the fridge the night before. Just different ways to kind of help ease that morning anxiety so that your day starts off a little better. Or it might be making that phone call for an appointment over the phone instead of doing it online. Just different ways to expose yourself to stimuli very gently, and having compassion on yourself while doing it can really ease that anxious cycle of wanting to retreat more and more from the stimuli. Okay. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about just a little self-compassion moment. We take in more information every day just on a daily basis than our ancestors probably did, like in their lifetime. I mean, the amount of ads we see every day, the amount of media we take in, the news, everything, it's all in our face. So when we look at the anxiety of the dizziness of freedom and the dizziness that comes with our anxiety, the amount of choices that maybe these people were philosophizing about, like in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, there were a lot less choices than the amount of choices that we're faced with right now. So I think even when we can feel guilty about the fact that we feel paralyzed by anxiety, I think having self-compassion and understanding that we are faced with so many more choices and so many more outcomes than many people before us, I think can help kind of put into perspective of, man, like I really am just trying to do the best I can with what I have. So from the metaphysical, I wanted to transition into the psychological, and the psychological being the intellectual and emotional component of anxiety. So I wanted to start with a quote from a famous psychologist, Melanie Klein. She said that there is in the unconscious a fear of the annihilation of life. The source of anxiety is never eliminated and enters as a perpetual factor into all anxiety situations. So what she's kind of arguing is like the bare bones of why we're anxious about what we're anxious about is that we are trying to survive. We're trying to get through our lives and we're trying to make it work. And so there's always this kind of bare bones anxiety of trying to survive through our lives. So some psychological components of anxiety include the idea of perceived control. So the idea of perceived control is that anxiety can be determined by a person's perceived ability to control a stressful event. So that can include trying to anticipate every single outcome. And that can be trying to plan ahead for the worst case scenario, trying to form plan A, plan B, plan C, D, all the way through Z, trying to control every possible outcome of what could happen. I don't know, this is a very niche topic, but if any of you have watched the show The Rehearsal on HBO, probably not. But the premise is, it's really trippy, but the guy has this unlimited budget, the host, and what he does is he meets with somebody who has this kind of perceived conflict, where the first episode is this guy is in a trivia team and he lied to his teammates that he has a master's degree when he has a bachelor's degree. And so he wants help in coming clean after 12 years of playing trivia with them. And so the host builds an entire set of the pub where they have trivia, hires actors that fill every role from the customers to the bartender, and with the participant, role plays through every single possible scenario that could go on, so that by the time he actually comes clean to his friend, he has an idea of what could possibly happen. And of course, at the end of the episode, it doesn't go the way you think it does. And so that's the idea of perceived control, is we literally, I mean, that's like the extreme end, but we try to control every possible outcome of the scenarios that we in for the sake of easing our own anxiety. So another one is stress appraisal. So our appraisal of certain environments can alter or forecast harm. So that's the idea of, say you are going to Kroger to get groceries and it is just packed in the parking lot, and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, it's going to be so loud in there and so busy and so overstimulating, like I'm already freaking out in the car. So we're appraising how much stress we can handle by making assumptions about our environment. Whether or not those assumptions are true, I mean, if it is a packed lot at Kroger, yeah, it's probably going to be a little crazy in there. But we try to appraise how we're going to be able to handle that. So our cognitive beliefs are core beliefs that the world and other people are harmful and that we need to protect ourselves. So these can be based on past traumas, past issues that we've had in our life, past experiences that have been highly negative. Like about a month ago, I had somebody attempt to carjack me while I was at a UDF parking lot. And for the next month, I was scared to get gas and even scared to go to the grocery store because I was like, what if I get carjacked again? And what was actually coming into play was, I just don't feel like the world is safe anymore. Like that kind of rose-colored glasses have been taken off, and I was coping with it by drawing back from my day-to-day life. And then cognitive distortions are habitual ways of thinking that are often inaccurate and debilitating. So we talked about that a little bit earlier in the ideas of appraising what we think people are already thinking about us, or jumping to the worst case scenario, or creating self-predicting prophecies about ourselves, or even capitalizing on our own weaknesses in order to predict the failures we're going to have in the future. So one of the ways that we actually can combat this is through an exercise, a cognitive exercise called asking the continuous why. And this can actually help us just get to the root of what we're anxious about. Sometimes when I look at anxiety, I kind of imagine, do you guys have seen those like little weird pond bugs that like skitter across the water? Like we kind of do that with it, and then there's so much more underneath the surface. So I'm gonna go off of an actual like situation that happened to me where there were consequences. But so I'm driving 80 miles an hour to work today. I ended up getting pulled over for this. And it was a decent ticket. This was in April. And the state trooper literally said, "Why are you driving so fast?" Like, she was yelling at me. And so she made me do this, like, in the car. And so I said, so it was why? Why am I driving 80 miles an hour to work today? Well, I don't want to be late. Why? I don't want to get fired. Why? Because I don't want to worry about money, and being fired is really embarrassing. And I wish I had dug through this even before I left for work that day, because had I done that, I would have realized it's okay to make mistakes sometimes. I can call my coworker who's already there and tell her I'm going to be late, and then just accept it. Instead, I drove 80 miles, got pulled over, had to pay a ticket. So I ended up paying for the fact that I let my own jumping to conclusions and my fears kind of get ahead of me in that situation.
And were you still late here?
I
just know. That's the rationale. I come over. If I get pulled over, I'm going to be late.
I had to call her while she was writing the ticket, and I was still late. The last one I want to talk about is the physiological. In the meantime, while we're thinking all of this stuff, what's our body doing? It turns out our body is doing a lot. So in our body, in our central nervous system, there's two different systems that are operating that help us control or manage our anxiety, or start it. I call them kind of the gas or the brake in this scenario. So one is the sympathetic nervous system, and one is the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's kind of the fight or flight, if you've heard of that before. I want you to imagine that you are hiking in the Smokies, and I'm sorry if there's not actually bears in the Smokies. I think there's bears in the Smokies. Yes, bears. Okay. So you're hiking in the Smokies, and there's a bear. You see a bear in the woods. What's going to start activating is that sympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic nervous system is dilating your pupils so that you see a little better. It's getting you to stop salivating. It relaxes your lungs so that you can getting more oxygen in there. It accelerates your heart rate. It actually slows down digestion. It stimulates glucose production, so sugars in your body, and it secretes adrenaline. So it's like, and this is all happening in like a fraction of a second. Like the second you lock eyes, or not even lock eyes, like you see like brown fur in your peripherals, your body is going to start doing that. And so your body is preparing you to do whatever you can do to get you to survive in this scenario. And there's three ways you can kind of go about it. You either fight the bear, which I don't recommend. You either run from the bear, which yeah, it's also like not really recommended either, or typically you freeze. And so those are kind of the ways that your body is trying to survive in that situation. Let's just say you get a little bit closer, and it's actually just like a cardboard cutout of Smokey the Bear. And they've just been playing you this whole time. You just got punked, basically. That's when the brake, or that parasympathetic nervous system, is going to start kicking in and kind of reversing everything it was doing. Your pupils constrict, your saliva starts flowing again, your nervous system, your digestive system's going again, your breathing slows down, your heart rate slows down, and adrenaline stops. And even though all of that is slowing down, it's still going to take time for your nervous system to kind of chill out and for your body to kind of chill out, because it's doing what you can to survive in that situation. I think it's really important to know about how our body's responding, because there's a really great documentary about trauma called Paper Tigers, and one of the quotes from that documentary is that when we are exposed to a lot of trauma or a lot of negative stimuli that causes anxiety, we are trained in our bodies to fight off tigers in a sense with that fight or flight, but we stop learning how to differentiate between real tigers and paper tigers. So we have all these paper tigers in our lives on a daily basis that are unavoidable, that don't require this kind of stimuli from our body, but we get it anyways because we're conditioned to react this way from our own anxiety. So I wanted to talk about a few ways to activate the brake, as I call it. The first one is deep breathing. Deep breathing sends signals to the body and to the brain that there is not danger present at the moment, because it is literally acting in the way that your parasympathetic nervous system would be. You're not going to be breathing slow in a situation where there's actual danger. It's going to be quick, it's going to be fast, you're going to be trying to breathe enough to get enough air coursing through your body to get out of there. So by breathing in the opposite way, that deep breathing, you're signaling your body that there actually is no danger present. And this is a fun little animation that you can actually follow to do deep breathing, but there's actually quite a few great little apps and things that also help with maintaining deep breathing. Mindfulness practices are also really great because they force you to engage in something other than your own head, but also engage your head at the same time. So these are visualization tools, these are anything that really just engages you while also kind of distracting you in a sense of like gardening or knitting or doing art or things like that, where yeah, maybe you're not sitting in like a yoga pose saying Om, but you're engaging your brain and focused on this task, and you're out of your head as far as kind of the racing thoughts that you may be getting from your anxiety. Exercise is also a really great one because it's an outlet for the adrenaline that might be running through your body. It can also produce endorphins or just other good chemicals that help calm your body down. It's just a healthy way to kind of get those anxious jitters out that you might be holding in all day. Talking about it is huge when it comes to anxiety, and your anxiety is going to tell you not to. So this one's kind of a counterintuitive, and this is also a way really to break that cycle. I've been in therapy for about coming on 3 years, and one of the ways it really, really helps me as a chronically anxious person is I just go in and just let it out. Just talk, because what I'm letting out is stuff that has been circulating in my head constantly for a week, 2 weeks, and just getting it out is just such a huge relief. So talking about it is a really, really powerful way to work with our anxiety. Shocking your nervous system and vagus nerve stimulation. So I'm going to go back a little bit. Yeah. If you look at this parasympathetic nervous system, one of the nerves it's connected to is actually the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve actually plays a huge role in anxiety and how we manage anxiety. And there's different ways to stimulate it. There is bilateral tapping. There is shocking it by literally submerging your head in cold water. There's different ways of stimulating it, and that can actually fast track telling your body to slow down and helping to activate that brake. There's a lot, it's a pretty big rabbit hole to get into. I highly recommend looking into a little bit, but it's a really great way to help kind of learn to manage our anxiety, especially in crisis moments where we're experiencing panic symptoms. That can be a really helpful way to kind of help us pull out of it. So I wanted to talk about a few resources that all of these I have actually used myself that I've found helpful, so I'm not just pulling stuff, but these are ones that I actually find really helpful. So the apps that I've used in the past that have been really helpful are Headspace and Calm, are both meditation apps. Headspace does these like 10-minute daily meditations that are really great. They're just guided. And then Calm is kind of the same thing. It's kind of an amalgamation of all sorts of different things. And then breath work is just for deep breathing. And they have all these kind of different ones where you can even practice strengthening your lungs, like if you're an athlete. So there's like all these different kinds of deep breathing exercises they have in there. Finch is a self-care and diary app, so it has prompts throughout the day that you can answer. It gives you little rewards for taking care of yourself throughout the day. It's a really fun little app. You have this it's called Finch because you literally have like a pet bird. And the more you take care of yourself, the more it takes care of your fictional bird. So it's super cute. Some books on anxiety. My Age of Anxiety is a memoir, so it's a great book to read in order to just not feel alone when it comes to your anxiety experience. Unraveling Anxiety is a very famous kind of self-help book on anxiety that's also really great. And then At Last a Life is also a really great resource on anxiety as well. Workbooks that are super helpful are the Anxiety and Phobia workbook, the Anxiety and Worry workbook, and the Mindfulness Journal. And then some really great podcasts to listen to if you just want to learn more, like maybe while you're driving or while you're working, is Anxious in Austin, the Calmer You podcast, Meditation Minis, and your Anxiety Toolkit. And these are all just great podcasts. And meditation podcasts are everywhere. There's so many. So those are also just really great resources. I mean, I wouldn't recommend trying to do all of it at the same time, but maybe pick one or two to integrate into your daily life, and I think it can just help ease the stress a little bit more. So that is all I've got. I went now I have 45 minutes. Oh shoot, okay. So if anybody actually has any questions about just managing anxieties, things like that, I'd be happy to answer some real quick. And I think I have these resources in the packet as well.
Page 6.
Yes. Yeah. So I think anxiety, I'm going to Google it. I love Googling definitions. So just to make sure I'm on the right track here, because I have my own personal definition for it.
Do that
Right. So I consider anxiety any feeling of worry, nervousness, or dread that's kind of ongoing. But I think anxiety can be short and I think it can be long. So there's chronic anxiety where these symptoms can persist for typically psychologically more than 2 weeks is when it's considered an anxiety disorder. But sometimes we experience anxiety for a few minutes, a few seconds, and it's gone. So I think any period of worry, nervousness, unease, either about an upcoming event or an event we're in is anxiety. Yeah?
So, what if you see anxiety around you?
Mm-hmm.
And it's creating anxiety over the inside?
Yeah. So are you saying you see it around you and it makes you anxious? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I think using your own toolkit for yourself. So one of the ways at the work I do, we've been dealing with some staffing changes and things like that, and just even kind of the tension. It has nothing to do with my job, but just kind of the tension in the office reaches onto me. So I've had to work on kind of figuring out what do I control in the moment, what's under my control as far as what's going on in the office, and I've had to kind of come to the conclusion of none of it. So even just learning how to kind of shorten my scope of, I can only really focus on what I can control in the moment, and even just talking it through with whoever else might be anxious around you, helping them process, being a support for them in the moment. But I think really focusing on what we genuinely have control over is really, I think, one of the bigger ways to help cope with that anxiety, because we can't control other people when they're anxious or other areas where there's tension, but we do have control over the way we respond or our own anxiety in a sense of kind of what is in our sphere.
If one is diagnosed that has general anxiety disorder, is that something that is really, really bad, or can be sorted with self-help, or just, absolutely you need to go see somebody?
Yeah.
Professional help.
That's a great question. So I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder in middle school. So I have been dealing with this for a really long time. I actually started pursuing therapy around that time. I think I was a freshman in high school when I first saw a therapist for it. And it was very helpful. I think it really depends on what the individual wants or the severity. I think when it comes to anxiety, I think a general feeling of dread or nervousness is understandable. When it really impacts your functioning, you find you can't leave the house, or you're extremely nervous while you're driving, or you struggle a lot to form connections with other people, or you can't be in crowded spaces. And I mean, a lot of this post-pandemic is a big deal too. When you find that it's really debilitating your quality of life, I think any time that it's really doing that is appropriate to see somebody. And there are types of counseling that are actually geared specifically towards anxiety, which one is called cognitive behavioral therapy, which is specifically geared towards how our thoughts work. There's also exposure therapy, which can sound really scary, but can be just a really helpful way to have somebody walk through. There's somatic therapy, which is more based on sensations, so helping you work with the bodily sensations. With anxiety, I think there's a lot of different routes we can go in treating it. I think it really depends on the beliefs of the individual. I don't think there's one right way. I will be honest, I use medication for anxiety, but for some people that's not what they want, and that is okay. Some people find that the self-help can be really important. For some people, faith is a really huge way to help them through their anxiety. I think it really just comes down to finding what's best for you in that scenario. I think going to a therapist or a counselor, I'll always just be an advocate for that in any situation, because I think it's just a good thing. There's always something in our lives that an extra set of eyes can be helpful for. But generalized anxiety disorder, I have found personally, in having been diagnosed with it, the combination of longer term therapy and using medication has been helpful. So for me, that's kind of what my journey looks like, but for everybody, it's going to be really different.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
If you're on, just a quick question, like someone's on medication for anxiety, is that something that if you're on it, you're going to be on it for a long time, or can it be a shorter course of medication typically? What do you find in that balance between long term?
Yes. Yeah, that one it's definitely individualized. I think a lot of people believe, and where a lot of trepidation around medication occurs is typically people believe that when they're put on it, it's lifelong. It's going to be this crutch for their whole lives. They're never going to get off it. They're never going to be able to reduce it. Anything like that. I will say from experience, although I am using certain medications, I've been on more in the past and I've been able to scale back. And then I've had periods of my life where I've had to go back on different ones and then scale back. It's a journey when it comes to anxiety. Typically, medically, the philosophy is that the goal is to help you learn coping skills and kind of build your toolbox so that that's not something you need lifelong. But I think realistically, I think that if it is a lifelong thing, that is okay. I wouldn't look at it as something you're contracted into, in a sense. It really just is a resource to kind of help you stabilize enough to step back and be able to kind of build your own toolkit. And then if you find that once you've built that you don't need it anymore, that's great. But for some people it really is, just like taking a diabetes medication or anything like that, something that can be really important for a long term. Anybody else? Yeah.
I know that this was kind of focused more so on us and dealing with anxiety more on a personal level, but kind of from a different perspective, if you know someone who has anxiety, has been diagnosed, but outside of that they're not really able to, or they don't want to really do much to take care of it, what from your experience has been helpful on how other people respond to such anxiety, whether it was your own before maybe you took it more seriously, or before you were on medication, or before you went to therapy, and what is a helpful response for other people to have? Like, is it helpful for other people to push you towards the direction where they know you probably need to go, or is it best for them to cater to some of those anxieties more specifically?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. When I first started my current therapy, so 3 years ago, one of my close friends in my life, who was kind of a mentor to me, spent 2 months trying to convince me to prioritize my mental health, and it took 2 months for her to convince me to actually go and seek help for it. And so I think in some ways, it is important if you have that really close, trusting relationship with somebody to be able to levy your concerns to them of like, I really just want you to feel okay, like I'm just kind of concerned. And to even be an assistance with them getting help, because some people I think actually really want help or want to tackle it, but the idea is so overwhelming that they don't know where to start. So sending them a few links or kind of helping them with resources I think can be really helpful. And I think the best way to start with all of that before even getting into encouraging it is just kind of extending that olive branch of I'm just here. Like I'm just here if you need to talk. I'm here if you need somebody to help distract you. When I had that nervous break in 2021, my mom was taking me on walks. My parents were making me play darts with them. Just things to help me in the moment get out of my head a little bit, and it was able to help me more focus on how I was going to cope with it in the long run.
So one of the challenges I think when we're talking about stuff like anxiety is stigma. Having 2 kids that deal with anxiety, deal with ADHD, deal with autism, one of the things that they constantly deal with is that stigmatism and the hurt that comes with that. So my question is do you feel like that is part of this conversation that we need to start having? And then how do we do it? Because one of the things that I want to be is an advocate for both of them. Advocating with people and helping them understand you don't understand what you think you understand. And trying to undo that. So my question is more around that stigma, how to undo that.
Yeah, I think the easiest way, and I think you're already doing this, is to undo it in the home. To let the home be a safe environment for them to levy their anxieties and be able to talk about their anxieties. I think also advocating for them, even in an academic or just life sense of, I think, pushing the idea that we move at different paces and that the way that Western society or just American culture wants us to move isn't the way that you have to move in life or have to go, and that if that's okay. I think, unfortunately, not every workplace or every school environment is going to be the best with that, but I think even advocating for if they need more assistance in school, like in college I was on disability for depression, so I had some more time for exams or extensions, things like that. That was actually really helpful. So finding the resources where they can find community as far as getting assistance and feeling like they can still achieve and grow and learn, even in a world that isn't exactly built for people with chronic anxiety, unfortunately, I think can be really helpful in helping in the long run. And advocating for ourselves, I think, is also, the more we learn about ourselves in the way our anxiety presents itself, can be a big help as well. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that's kind of what I can think of there. I think I am out of time. I'm so sorry.